The candle's flame flickered against the rough timber walls of the abandoned line shack, casting dancing shadows across the face of the woman who sat reading with such fierce concentration that she didn't hear the horse approach outside. Tanner Foster had been riding for 3 days straight, tracking a stolen mare through the Dakota Territory's unforgiving landscape, and the last thing he expected to find in this forgotten shelter, 15 miles south of Red Bluff, was another living soul, much less a woman alone in the wilderness on a cold October night in 1881. He pushed the door open carefully, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip, but the motion stopped the moment his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw her there. She looked up from her book with a startled gasp, her green eyes wide with alarm, auburn hair falling loose around her shoulders. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, and she held that book like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Easy now," Tanner said, raising both hands to show he meant no harm. "I didn't know anyone was here. I've been tracking a horse and needed shelter for the night." The woman stood quickly, clutching the book to her chest. She was wearing a simple gray dress that had seen better days, and her face was smudged with dust from the trail. "This shack was empty when I arrived," she said, her voice steadier than he expected. "I suppose we're both seeking refuge from the cold." Tanner studied her for a moment, noting the way she positioned herself near the far wall, keeping distance between them. He was 26, weathered by years of working cattle drives and living rough, and he knew how he must look to her, standing there in his dusty clothes and worn leather vest, 3 days of stubble on his jaw. "Name's Tanner Foster. I work at the Double R Ranch about 30 miles west of here." "Fiona Ortega," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it, a hesitation, that made him think there was a story behind why she was out here alone. "That's a long way from any town, Miss Ortega. You mind me asking what brings you to an abandoned line shack in the middle of nowhere?" She looked down at the book in her hands, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "I'm traveling to Red Bluff. I have family there, or I hope I do. My stagecoach was robbed 2 days ago. They took everything except the clothes on my back and this book. I've been walking since then." Tanner felt something tighten in his chest. 2 days walking through this country alone with winter coming on. She was lucky to be alive. "You've come about 15 miles. That's no small feat in this terrain." "I had no choice," Fiona said simply. "Stay and wait for help that might never come, or walk and take my chances." He nodded, respecting that kind of grit. "I can take you to Red Bluff tomorrow. My horse can carry 2, and I need to report the horse theft to the sheriff anyway." Suspicion flickered across her face, and he couldn't blame her for it. Out here, a woman alone had to be careful about who she trusted. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Tanner said, "and because no one should be alone out here. The Lakota bands are mostly peaceful now, but there are still outlaws and worse roaming these parts." Fiona seemed to consider this, her green eyes searching his face in the candlelight. Finally, she nodded. "I would be grateful for the help, Mr. Foster. But I'll keep my distance, and I'll expect you to be a gentleman." "Wouldn't have it any other way, madam." He gestured to the opposite corner of the small shack. "I'll bed down over there. You keep the candle and your space. I've got my bedroll and I've slept in worse places." As he moved to settle his gear in the far corner, he noticed the way she relaxed slightly, her shoulders dropping an inch. She sat back down, and after a moment she opened her book again, tilting it toward the candlelight. He found himself curious about what she was reading, what could be so engrossing that she'd risk her eyesight by such dim light. "What's the book?" he asked, unrolling his bedding. She looked up, surprised by the question. "Jane Eyre. Have you heard of it?" "Can't say I have. I'm not much for reading. never had the time to learn properly. Something shifted in her expression, a softness that hadn't been there before. "You can't read." "I can read some. Enough to get by. Signs, wanted posters, that sort of thing, but nothing like a whole book." He said it matter-of-factly, without shame. It was just the way things were for most cowboys. You learned what you needed to survive, and reading novels wasn't part of that. "Would you like me to read to you?" The offer came out hesitantly, as if she wasn't quite sure why she was making it. Tanner paused in his preparations, genuinely surprised. "I wouldn't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble. I've been alone with my thoughts for 2 days. It might be nice to have someone to share the story with." She smiled then, just a small curve of her lips, but it transformed her face entirely. "Besides, you're giving me safe passage to Red Bluff. It seems like fair trade." So she read to him as the wind howled outside the shack and the candle burned lower. Her voice was clear and melodious, bringing the words to life in a way he'd never experienced before. She read about a young woman named Jane who refused to be broken by hardship, who maintained her dignity and sense of self despite a world that tried to diminish her. Tanner found himself drawn into the story, but more than that, he found himself watching Fiona as she read. The way her expressions changed with the narrative, the passion in her voice when Jane stood up for herself. When the candle finally guttered low, she marked her place and looked over at him. "We should sleep. Tomorrow will be a long ride." "That was something," Tanner said honestly. "I never knew stories could be like that." "Books have been my escape for as long as I can remember," Fiona said softly. "When my mother died, I was 12. My father worked on the railroad, always traveling. Books became my companions, my teachers, my friends. They showed me worlds beyond the small rooms I lived in." "Where's your father now?" Her face clouded. "He died 6 months ago. Accident on the line. That's why I'm going to Red Bluff. My mother's sister lives there, or she did 10 years ago. I wrote to her, but I never received a response. I have nowhere else to go." The loneliness in her voice resonated with something deep inside Tanner. He'd been alone most of his life too, in a different way. His parents had died of fever when he was 15, and he'd been drifting from ranch to ranch ever since, never staying long enough to put down roots, never letting himself get close to anyone. The other cowboys were companions, but not friends. The ranchers were employers, not family. He existed in a space of solitude even when surrounded by people. "Get some rest, Miss Ortega. I promise you'll be safe tonight." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you, Mr. Foster. Thank you." He lay awake long after he heard her breathing even out into sleep, staring at the rough ceiling beams and thinking about that story, about the woman who read it with such feeling, about the unexpected turn his solitary life had just taken. The morning came cold and bright, frost sparkling on the ground outside the shack. Tanner woke first, as was his habit, and went out to check on his horse and survey the area. His bay gelding, Ranger, was grazing contentedly on the sparse grass near a small creek. The sky was clear, promising a good day for travel. When he returned to the shack, Fiona was awake, trying to smooth her hair into some semblance of order. She looked embarrassed when she saw him. "I must look a fright." "You look like someone who's been through an ordeal and survived it," Tanner said. "That's nothing to be ashamed of." She smiled at that, more genuine than the night before. "You're kind to say so. Are we ready to leave?" "Soon as you are. I've got some jerky and hardtack in my saddlebags." "Not much, but it'll keep us until we reach Red Bluff." They ate a sparse breakfast, and Tanner noticed how she tried to refuse more than a small portion, probably worried about taking his supplies. He insisted she eat more, explaining that he knew the country and could hunt along the way if needed. Finally, she accepted, and he felt oddly pleased that he could provide for her, even in this small way. Mounting up was awkward at first. Ranger was used to carrying one rider, and Fiona was nervous about the horse. But Tanner helped her up behind him, showing her where to hold onto his waist, and soon they were moving at a steady walk across the rolling prairie. "Tell me about Red Bluff," Fiona said after they'd been riding for an hour. "What kind of town is it?" "It's growing," Tanner replied. "Started as a trading post maybe 20 years ago, right on the Missouri River. Now it's got a main street with a general store, a hotel, a saloon, a church, and a schoolhouse. There's a sheriff, a doctor, and even a newspaper. Probably about 300 people living there and in the surrounding ranches." "Is there a bookstore?" He smiled at that. Of course that would be her question. "No bookstore, but the general store keeps a few books, and the church has a lending library of sorts. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Sullivan, she's educated back east. She orders books and shares them with folks who are interested." "That sounds wonderful," Fiona said, and he could hear the genuine pleasure in her voice. "I'll have to meet her when we arrive." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the sun climbing higher, warming the air just enough to take the bite out of the cold. Tanner was acutely aware of her arms around his waist, the way she leaned against his back when they traversed rough ground. It had been a long time since he'd been this close to anyone, and longer still since he'd felt the particular awareness that came from being near a woman he found attractive. "Can I ask you something?" Fiona's voice broke into his thoughts. "Sure." "Why do you work on a ranch instead of having your own place? You seem capable enough." It was a fair question. "Never had the means to buy land of my own, and I guess I never felt the need to settle. It's easier to move on when things don't work out if you don't have roots holding you down." "Don't you get lonely?" The question cut closer than she probably realized. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but lonely with freedom is better than trapped with company. Least that's what I always told myself." "I understand that," Fiona said quietly. "After my father died, I lived in a boarding house in Cheyenne. I was surrounded by people all the time, but I'd never felt more alone. Everyone was so caught up in their own lives, their own struggles. No one really saw me. I was just the quiet girl in room 7 who always had her nose in a book." "Is that why you're going to your aunt? To find somewhere you belong?" "I suppose so. I'm hoping she'll remember me, that she'll want me there. But even if she doesn't, Red Bluff seems like the kind of place where a person could make a fresh start. Maybe I could find work as a teacher or help in the general store. I'm good with numbers and I can read and write well. Those skills must be worth something." "They're worth a lot," Tanner said with conviction. "More than you might think. This country's growing and it needs educated people, especially women who can teach the children." "Do you think I could really do it? Build a life there?" He heard the vulnerability in her question, the need for reassurance. "I think you already proved you can do hard things when you walked for 2 days through hostile territory with nothing but a book and your determination. Starting over in a town with resources and people around, that'll be easy by comparison." She squeezed his waist gently, a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you for saying that. I needed to hear it." They stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat more of the jerky. Tanner found a clear stream and they both drank their fill, the cold water refreshing after the dry morning. Fiona insisted on reading more of her book during their rest, and Tanner found himself looking forward to it, wanting to know what happened next to Jane Eyre. She read about Jane's time at Load School, the harsh conditions, the cruelty she endured, but also her friendship with Helen Burns. When Helen died in the story, Fiona's voice caught slightly, and Tanner saw her blink back tears. Without thinking, he reached over and gently touched her hand. "It's just a story," he said softly. "I know," she replied, not pulling her hand away. But good stories feel real, don't they? That's what makes them matter. He didn't have words for what he felt in that moment, looking at this woman who cried for fictional characters and who'd survived real hardship without complaint. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, and he found himself wishing their journey to Red Bluff was longer, that he had more time to know her before they reached town, and she went her separate way. They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape gradually shifting from open prairie to more wooded areas as they neared the Missouri River. Tanner pointed out landmarks, telling her about the country, sharing what he knew about surviving out here. She listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions. "You know this land well," she observed. "You must love it even if you don't stay in one place." "I do," he admitted. "It's harsh and it's beautiful and it's honest. Out here, things are what they are. A man is judged by his actions, not his past or his prospects. There's something freeing about that. And yet you're alone." "And yet I'm alone," he echoed. "But maybe that's been changing without me realizing it. Maybe a man can carry the freedom of this land with him even when he chooses to stay in one place. Maybe the loneliness is just a habit, not a necessity." He felt her tense slightly behind him, as if his words had struck a chord. "Are you saying what I think you're saying, Mr. Foster?" Tanner hadn't planned to say anything, hadn't planned to let her know that he was already dreading the moment they'd reach Red Bluff and she'd slip out of his life as suddenly as she'd entered it. But the words came anyway, honest and raw. "I'm saying that meeting you has made me realize there's a difference between being alone by choice and being alone by habit. And I'm thinking maybe I've been alone by habit for too long." They rode in silence for several minutes, and Tanner cursed himself for speaking too plainly, too soon. She was a proper woman with education and prospects, headed toward family and a new life. He was just a cowboy who couldn't even read a whole book properly, who owned nothing but his horse and his gear, who drifted from job to job. What did he have to offer someone like her? "I'm thinking the same thing," Fiona said finally, so quietly he almost missed it over the sound of the horse's hooves. "Last night, when you offered to help me without asking for anything in return, when you gave me space and respected my fear, and then when you listened to me read like it mattered, like the story mattered, like I mattered. I haven't felt seen like that in so long, Mr. Foster. Maybe ever." His heart hammered in his chest. "Tanner, please call me Tanner." "Tanner," she repeated, and his name in her voice was the sweetest sound. "And you should call me Fiona." "Fiona," he said, testing it, liking the way it felt. "That's a beautiful name." "It means fair or white," she said. "My mother was Irish, came over when she was just a girl. She met my father in New York, and they went west looking for opportunity. She used to tell me stories about Ireland, about green hills and ancient castles and magic. I think that's where my love of stories came from her. She sounds like she was special." "She was. I wish you could have met her. She would have liked you. She always said the measure of a man wasn't in what he owned, but in how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him in return. You've proven that today, helping me when you had no reason to except that it was right." They reached Red Bluff just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the wide Missouri River. The town was bigger than Fiona had imagined, with actual streets and boardwalks, buildings that looked permanent and well-built. Lamps were being lit in windows, and she could hear the sounds of life, people talking, a piano playing somewhere, the bark of a dog. Tanner rode straight to the sheriff's office, a sturdy building near the center of town. He helped Fiona dismount, his hands strong and steady on her waist, and she felt the loss of his warmth immediately in the cooling evening air. The sheriff was a lean man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. His name was Daniel Morris, and he listened to both their stories with careful attention, asking questions and taking notes. "I'll send word about the stagecoach robbery to the territorial marshal," Sheriff Morris said. "That's the third one this month. We've got a gang working the route between here and Deadwood. As for your stolen mare, Tanner, I'll keep an eye out. What's her description again?" While Tanner gave details about his horse, Fiona looked around the office. There were wanted posters on the wall, a gun rack, a desk piled with papers. It all seemed very official and organized, which was reassuring after the chaos of the robbery and her days walking alone. "Now, Miss Ortega," the sheriff said, turning his attention to her. "You said you're looking for your aunt. What's her name?" "Catherine O'Brien. She would be about 50 now, I think. She married a man named Thomas O'Brien 10 years ago, and they came to Red Bluff. That was the last I heard from her." The sheriff's expression shifted, becoming sympathetic. "I'm sorry to tell you this, miss, but Catherine O'Brien died 3 years ago. Fever took her and half a dozen others one bad winter. Thomas, her husband, he stayed on for a while, but he moved back east about a year ago. Couldn't bear to be here without her." The words hit Fiona like a physical blow. She'd known this was a possibility, had tried to prepare herself for it, but hearing it confirmed was devastating. Her last hope of family, of belonging somewhere, was gone. She swayed slightly, and immediately Tanner was there, his hand under her elbow, steadying her. "Easy now," he said softly. "I've got you." "Where am I supposed to go?" The words came out barely above a whisper. "What am I supposed to do?" Sheriff Morris looked uncomfortable. "The hotel down the street is decent and reasonable, and like I said, this town needs teachers and skilled workers. You'll find a place, miss. Folks here are good about helping newcomers." Tanner's jaw tightened. "She needs more than a hotel room and vague promises. She needs a real plan." "I'm open to suggestions, Foster." Before Tanner could respond, the door to the office opened and a woman swept in, bringing a swirl of cold air and the scent of fresh bread. She was in her 40s, handsome rather than pretty, with intelligent brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Daniel, I brought you dinner since you missed supper again," she said, setting a covered basket on his desk. Then she noticed Fiona and Tanner, and her expression became curious. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting, Margaret," the sheriff said. "This is Miss Fiona Ortega and Tanner Foster. They've had some troubles on the road. Fiona, Tanner, this is Margaret Sullivan. Her husband is our preacher, and she runs the lending library I mentioned." Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest and sympathy. "What kind of troubles? Can I help?" Fiona found herself pouring out the whole story again, and there was something about Margaret's kind, no-nonsense manner that made it easier. When she got to the part about her aunt being dead and having nowhere to go, Margaret immediately stepped forward and took her hands. "You'll stay with us tonight," she said firmly. "We have a spare room in the parsonage, and I won't hear any argument. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent, but tonight you need rest and a decent meal and a friendly face." "I couldn't impose," Fiona started, but Margaret cut her off. "It's not an imposition, it's what neighbors do, and you're our neighbor now whether you have a house yet or not." She turned to Tanner. "Will you walk us to the parsonage? It's just 2 blocks, but it's getting dark." "Of course," Tanner said immediately. They left the sheriff's office, and Tanner led Ranger by the reins as they walked through the streets of Red Bluff. Margaret kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out buildings and introducing Fiona to people they passed. It was clear she was a woman of influence in the town, someone people respected and listened to. The parsonage was a neat white house next to the church, with a small garden out front and warm light glowing from the windows. Margaret's husband, Reverend John Sullivan, was a tall, gentle-mannered man who welcomed Fiona with the same easy hospitality as his wife. "Tanner, will you stay for supper?" Margaret asked. "It's just stew, but there's plenty." Tanner hesitated, and Fiona found herself hoping desperately that he'd say yes. She wasn't ready to say goodbye to him yet, wasn't ready to let him walk out of her life after just one day and night. The thought of him leaving made her chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand. "Please stay," she said, and she didn't care if her feelings showed in her voice. "I'd like you to." His eyes met hers and something passed between them, a recognition, a possibility. "I'd be honored," he said. They ate together around the Sullivans' dining table, and it was the most normal, comfortable meal Fiona had experienced in months. Margaret and John were easy company, interested without being intrusive, kind without being patronizing. They wanted to know about Fiona's education, her skills, her interests. When she mentioned her love of books and reading, Margaret's face lit up. "We desperately need a proper librarian," she said enthusiastically. "I've been trying to organize and manage the lending library along with all my other duties, but it's too much. If you're interested, the church council has a small budget for the position. It wouldn't be much, maybe $10 a month, but it would be something. And there's a little room above the library space in the church hall. It's small, but it's private and has a stove. You could live there if you wanted." Fiona felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you serious? You'd hire me just like that?" "I'm quite serious," Margaret said. "Though it's not really up to me alone. The church council would need to approve it, but I chair the council, and I can't imagine anyone objecting. We've been talking about hiring a librarian for months, but we haven't found the right person. Someone who genuinely loves books and would care for them properly. You clearly qualify." "I would love nothing more," Fiona said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much." Tanner watched this exchange with a small smile, and when Fiona glanced at him, he winked. It was such an unexpectedly playful gesture from the serious cowboy that she nearly laughed out loud, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. After dinner, Margaret showed Fiona to the spare room, a cozy space with a real bed, clean linens, and even a small bookshelf with several volumes. "Take your time settling in," Margaret said. "There's a basin and pitcher for washing, and I'll leave a nightgown on the bed for you. Your dress could use a good cleaning after your ordeal." "You're too kind," Fiona said. "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank me by becoming part of our community," Margaret replied. "We need people like you here, Fiona, people with education and passion and kindness. Red Bluff is still young enough that one person can make a real difference." When Fiona came back downstairs after washing up and changing into the borrowed nightgown with a robe over it, she found Tanner getting ready to leave. Her stomach dropped at the sight. "You're going?" "I need to get back to the ranch tomorrow," he said. "I'm already 2 days overdue, and the boss will be wondering where I am. But I wanted to say goodbye properly." They stepped out onto the porch, away from the Sullivans' tactful presence. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead, the kind of sky you only saw far from big cities. Fiona wrapped her arms around herself, and Tanner immediately shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "You'll be cold," she protested. "I'll be fine. I'm used to it." He looked down at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Fiona, I know we just met. I know this is fast and maybe foolish, but I need to say this before I lose my nerve," her heart hammered. "Say what?" "I don't want this to be goodbye, not really. I want to come back to Red Bluff and see you again, if you're willing, if you'd want that." Relief and joy flooded through her. "I would want that very much. I was afraid you'd just ride away and I'd never see you again." "Not a chance," he said, and the intensity in his voice made her shiver for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. You've done something to me, Fiona Ortega. In one day and one night, you've made me think about things I'd given up on. Home, belonging, future. I don't know where this leads, but I want to find out if you'll let me. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I want to find out too. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her cheek with his calloused hand. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of it. When she opened them again, he was looking at her like she was something precious, something worth cherishing. I'll be back in a week, he promised. Maybe sooner if I can manage it. Will you wait for me? I'll wait, she promised. And Tanner, thank you. For finding me, for helping me, for seeing me. You've given me more than safe passage. You've given me hope. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. You gave me hope too. I just didn't know I was looking for it until I opened that shack door and found you reading by candlelight. He left then, walking into the night with his horse, and Fiona stood on the porch watching until he disappeared from view. When she finally went back inside, Margaret was waiting with a knowing smile. He's a good man, that Tanner Foster, quiet and steady, the kind of man who keeps his promises. I barely know him, Fiona said, but she was smiling. Sometimes the heart knows before the head catches up, Margaret said wisely. Come on, let's get you to bed. Tomorrow's a new day and we have a library to discuss. The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity. Margaret presented Fiona's case to the church council, and they approved her hiring unanimously. The library space was in a large room in the church hall, with shelves along 2 walls and a reading area with tables and chairs. The room above it was indeed small, but it had good light, a functional stove and enough space for a bed, a table, a chair, and a trunk for her belongings. The Sullivans helped her move in, and the women of the church donated items to help her set up housekeeping. Quilts, dishes, curtains, a lamp, even some food staples. Everyone was curious about the new librarian, and Fiona found herself telling the story of the robbery and her rescue over and over, though she kept the depth of her feelings for Tanner private. She threw herself into organizing the library, cataloging the books, creating a lending system, establishing hours that the room would be open. There were nearly 200 books in the collection, ranging from classics to religious texts to practical manuals. It wasn't a huge collection, but it was substantial for a frontier town, and Fiona treated each volume with care and respect. The children of Red Bluff discovered her quickly. She started reading aloud every afternoon, welcoming anyone who wanted to come listen. Soon she had regular attendees, children who would rush over after school let out, eager to hear the next chapter of whatever story she was sharing. She was reading them the Swiss Family Robinson, and they were enthralled. But every moment of every day, part of her mind was on Tanner. She wondered what he was doing, if he was thinking about her, if he'd really come back like he promised. She told herself not to get her hopes up too high, that she'd only known him for such a short time, that maybe the intensity of their connection had been situational, born of crisis and proximity rather than anything real or lasting. Still, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her on the porch, the promise in his voice, the tenderness of his hand on her cheek. She couldn't stop thinking about how safe she'd felt riding behind him, how natural it had felt to wrap her arms around his waist and trust him completely. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd listened to her read, genuinely interested, genuinely moved by the story. 8 days after he'd left, she was in the library organizing a shipment of new books that Margaret had ordered when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She turned, expecting one of the children or perhaps Margaret, and instead found Tanner standing in the doorway. He'd cleaned up, shaved, was wearing clothes that looked new or at least freshly laundered. His hair was trimmed neatly, and he was holding his hat in his hands. But his eyes were the same, intense and sincere, and they were focused entirely on her. "You came back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I would." He stepped into the room, looking around at the shelves, the organized books, the cozy reading area. "This is nice. You've done a lot in a week. I've been keeping busy." She set down the book she was holding, her hands suddenly shaking. "I wasn't sure you'd really come." "I thought about you every day," he said simply. "Every hour, if I'm being honest. I couldn't work without wondering what you were doing, if you were settling in okay, if you were thinking about me too." "I was," she admitted. "I am." He crossed the room until he was standing in front of her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Fiona, I need you to understand something. I'm not a man of means. I've got about $30 saved, my horse and my gear. I work for wages and I move when the work runs out. I can't offer you fancy things or an easy life." "I don't want fancy things," she said. "I never have. But I can offer you honesty," he continued, "loyalty, hard work, protection, and a love that already runs deeper than makes sense for knowing you such a short time. If you'll have me, if you'll give me a chance to prove myself to you, I'll do everything in my power to build a life worth sharing. I'll find steady work nearby. I'll save money. I'll be the kind of man worthy of a woman like you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Tanner, you're already worthy. You saved my life and then you gave me hope and helped me find a place to belong. You listened to me and respected me and made me feel seen. I don't need you to be anything other than who you are. So you'll let me court you properly, let me come visit and take you walking and get to know you the right way." "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, absolutely yes." He smiled that rare, beautiful smile and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "Can I kiss you, Fiona? I've been thinking about it for 8 days straight and I'm about to lose my mind." Instead of answering with words, she rose up on her toes and closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question and an answer. But then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. And the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise and the beginning of something neither of them could fully name yet, but both recognized as essential. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tanner rested his forehead against hers. "I found steady work," he said. "The Double R Ranch doesn't need me full-time, but there's a smaller spread just outside Red Bluff, the Crawford place, and they need a hand. The pay's not great, but it's year-round and I can stay nearby. I start in 3 days." "That's wonderful," Fiona said, her heart soaring. "Does that mean you'll be here in Red Bluff regularly? Every chance I get, which will be often because the Crawford place is only 6 miles out. I can ride in on Sundays and any other time I can get away. We'll have time together, Fiona. Real time to build something." She kissed him again, unable to help herself, and he responded with enthusiasm, his hands spanning her waist, holding her like she was something precious he was afraid might disappear. Over the next months, Tanner became a fixture in Red Bluff, specifically in Fiona's life. He courted her properly, with all the traditional formalities that a respectable woman deserved. He'd ride into town on Sunday mornings and attend church, sitting in the back pew, but always catching her eye and smiling. After services, he'd walk with her back to the library, carrying any books or supplies she'd brought to church, and they'd spend the afternoon together. Sometimes they'd walk by the river, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood, about losing his parents, about the years of drifting. She told him about her father's absence, her mother's death, the loneliness of her years in Cheyenne. They shared their hopes and fears, their dreams for the future, the small details of their daily lives. Other times they'd stay in the library and she'd continue reading to him. They finished Jane Eyre together, and when they reached the ending with Jane and Rochester reunited and married, Tanner looked at her with such intensity that her breath caught. "I want that," he said. "Not the big house or the fortune, but that kind of partnership, that kind of equal love. I want to be someone's home, and I want someone to be mine." "You already are," Fiona whispered. "You're already my home, Tanner. I love you." It was the first time either of them had said the words aloud, though they'd been hovering unspoken between them for weeks. Tanner's eyes widened, then filled with emotion. He stood from his chair and pulled her to her feet, holding her hands tightly. "I love you too, Fiona Ortega. I love your mind and your heart and your strength. I love the way you care for those books like they're treasures. I love the way you read to children and make them excited about stories. I love the way you look at me like I'm someone worth knowing. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much." "Then ask me," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Ask me what you want to ask me." He dropped to one knee right there in the library, still holding her hands, looking up at her with his whole heart in his eyes. "Fiona, I don't have a ring yet, but I will. I don't have much to offer except myself and a promise that I'll work every day to be the husband you deserve. Will you marry me? Will you let me be your family, your home, your partner in all things?" "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Tanner, I'll marry you. I want nothing more than to be your wife." He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and neither of them noticed Margaret standing in the doorway until she cleared her throat loudly. "I take it congratulations are in order," she said, trying to look stern but failing completely, her smile breaking through. "We're getting married," Fiona announced, glowing with happiness. "I had a feeling this was coming," Margaret said warmly. "John and I have been taking bets on when Tanner would finally propose. He won, by the way. Said you'd do it before summer." Tanner grinned. "Can Reverend Sullivan perform the ceremony? I know Fiona would want it to be proper and in the church." "He'd be honored," Margaret assured them. "When were you thinking?" Tanner looked at Fiona. "Soon. I don't want to wait longer than necessary." "Unless you want a big wedding with lots of planning." "I want to marry you," Fiona said simply. "I don't need anything elaborate, just you and me and our community to witness it." "A month, then," Margaret suggested. "That gives us time to organize a proper celebration without making you wait too long." They agreed, and the next weeks passed in a blur of preparation and joy. The women of Red Bluff rallied around Fiona, helping her sew a wedding dress from fabric that Margaret insisted on buying. It was simple but beautiful, white cotton with lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Fiona felt like a princess when she tried it on. Tanner used his savings to buy a thin gold band from the jeweler who'd recently set up shop in Red Bluff. It wasn't fancy, but it was real gold and it was sturdy, meant to last a lifetime. He showed it to Reverend Sullivan beforehand, nervous that it wasn't nice enough, but the preacher assured him that the ring's value came not from its cost but from what it represented. The wedding took place on a Sunday afternoon in June of 1882. The church was full, practically the whole town turning out to witness the union. Fiona walked down the aisle without a father to give her away, but Margaret and John stood with her as family, and that felt right. She'd built her own family here in Red Bluff, chosen family who loved and supported her. Tanner waited at the altar wearing new clothes he'd purchased specially for the occasion. a dark suit that made him look handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire. But when Fiona appeared, his whole face transformed. He looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered, like she was the miracle he'd stopped believing could happen. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other through all circumstances. When Tanner slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands were shaking slightly, and she loved him even more for the evidence of his emotion. When Reverend Sullivan pronounced them husband and wife, Tanner kissed her with such tenderness and joy that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The reception was held in the church hall, the same building that housed Fiona's library. The community had provided food, a simple but abundant feast. There was music, a fiddle player from one of the ranches, and dancing. Tanner was stiff at first, admitting he didn't really know how to dance properly, but Fiona didn't care. They swayed together to the music, her head on his shoulder, his arms around her, and it was perfect. As the sun set and the celebration wound down, Tanner and Fiona slipped away to the room above the library, which would be their home for now. It was small, but it was theirs, and Fiona had decorated it with care. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, wildflowers in a jar on the table, clean linens on the bed. Tanner stood in the doorway, looking around the small space, and his expression was wondering. "I have a home," he said softly. "A real home with a wife who's waiting for me. I never thought I'd have this." Fiona crossed to him and took his hands, drawing him inside and closing the door. "You have it now. You have me and I have you, and we have each other. That's all we need." That night, they came together as husband and wife with tenderness and passion, learning each other, belonging to each other. Afterward, lying in the small bed with Fiona curled against his side, Tanner felt a contentment he'd never experienced before. This woman, this fierce, intelligent, kind woman who'd been reading by candlelight when he found her, had transformed his entire existence. "What are you thinking?" Fiona asked sleepily, tracing patterns on his chest. "I'm thinking that you're the greatest story I ever knew," he said. "Better than any book, better than any tale. The story of how I found you and you found me, how we built this life together. It's the only story I ever want to be part of." She lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "I was just thinking something similar. I've read hundreds of books, lived in countless stories through pages. But this us, what we have, it's better than any fiction. It's real and it's ours and it's beautiful." "Will you read to me?" he asked. "I know it's late, but I'd like to start a new story with you, as husband and wife." Fiona smiled and kissed him softly, then rose from the bed and wrapped herself in a robe. She lit the lamp on the table and selected a book from the small shelf she'd brought up from the library. "How about something new for both of us? A story we can discover together." She settled back into bed beside him, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. She opened the book and began to read, her voice soft and melodious in the quiet room. Tanner listened, content, thinking that this was what happiness felt like. Not grand gestures or wealth or adventure, but simply being with the person you loved, sharing a story, building a life one moment at a time. The months that followed their wedding were not without challenges. Tanner's work at the Crawford Ranch was demanding, and there were days when he came home exhausted, barely able to eat before falling into bed. The pay was modest, and they had to be careful with every penny. The room above the library was cold in winter, despite the stove, and there were nights when they huddled together under every quilt they owned, their breath visible in the air. But there were far more moments of joy than hardship. Fiona continued her work as librarian, and the collection grew as more people donated books or Margaret ordered new ones. The reading sessions with children expanded, and parents started asking if Fiona might tutor their children in reading and writing for a small fee. She agreed, and the extra income, though not much, helped. Tanner proved himself invaluable at the Crawford Ranch. He had a way with horses that impressed Mr. Crawford, and he worked harder than any hand the rancher had employed before. By fall, Mr. Crawford offered him a permanent position with a slight raise in wages and the possibility of more responsibility in the future. He said if I keep proving myself, he might make me foreman in a year or two, Tanner told Fiona excitedly one evening. That would mean better pay, Fiona. Maybe enough that we could start saving for our own place eventually. That would be wonderful, Fiona said, genuinely happy for him. But Tanner, I want you to know that I'm happy now, exactly as things are. You don't have to work yourself to death trying to give me more. I know, he said, pulling her close. But I want to. I want to build something with you, something that's ours. Maybe a little house with a proper kitchen and a room for a library, because I know you'll never stop collecting books. Maybe some land where we could have a garden, maybe some chickens. Nothing fancy, just ours. She kissed him, moved by his dreams that always included her, that were about building a life together rather than achieving something for himself alone. Then we'll work toward it together. My tutoring money can go into savings too. Between both of us, we'll get there. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, a partnership in the truest sense. Tanner would leave early in the mornings, often before dawn, and Fiona would have breakfast waiting for him, simple but nourishing. She'd kiss him goodbye at the door, watching from the window as he rode off toward the Crawford Ranch. Then she'd go down to the library, preparing for the day's reading sessions or organizing books or meeting with tutoring students. In the evenings, Tanner would return, and they'd have dinner together, talking about their days. Fiona would tell him funny things the children had said or about new books that had arrived. Tanner would share ranch stories about difficult horses he'd gentled, or cattle they'd moved, or the characters who worked alongside him. After dinner, Fiona would read to him, continuing whatever book they were sharing. They discovered that Tanner was learning to read better just from listening to her, following along with his eyes as she read aloud, picking up patterns and words. I think I could read a whole book by myself now, he said one night, about 6 months into their marriage. Not fast, but I could do it. Fiona looked at him with pride. I think you could too. Would you like to try? She selected a book with simpler language, one of the adventure stories the children loved, and handed it to him. Tanner held it carefully, like it was something precious, and opened to the first page. He read aloud slowly, stumbling over some words but getting most of them right. Fiona helped when he got stuck, patient and encouraging, and by the end of the first chapter he was beaming with accomplishment. I did it, he said, wonder in his voice. I actually read a whole chapter. You did, Fiona confirmed, her eyes suspiciously bright. I'm so proud of you, Tanner. It's because of you, he said. You made me believe I could do it. You never made me feel stupid or less than. You just helped me learn at my own pace. That's what love does, Fiona said softly. It builds people up. It helps them become who they're meant to be. As winter gave way to spring in 1883, Fiona realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was certain before telling Tanner. She chose a quiet evening when he came home from work, leading him to sit down at their small table. I have something to tell you, she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. Tanner looked concerned immediately. Is everything all right? Everything is perfect, she assured him. I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby. In late September or early October, I think. For a moment, he just stared at her, processing the information. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she'd ever seen on him. Pure joy and wonder mixed together. He stood so quickly his chair toppled backward, and he crossed to her in 2 strides, dropping to his knees in front of where she sat and pressing his hands gently to her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Fiona, I'm going to be a father." "You're going to be a wonderful father," she said, running her fingers through his hair. "Our child is lucky to have you." He looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I never had a family, not really, not since I was 15. And now I have you and we're going to have a baby. I have a family again. I have everything." She pulled him up and into her arms, and they held each other tightly, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of this new blessing, this new chapter in their story. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Fiona tired more easily and had to cut back on some of her activities. The women of Red Bluff rallied around her again, offering advice and support and helping her prepare for the baby. Margaret was particularly helpful, having raised 3 children of her own, and she guided Fiona through the practical aspects of preparing for motherhood. Tanner became even more protective and devoted. He took on extra work when he could, saving every penny for the baby's needs. He built a cradle with his own hands, working on it in the evenings after long days at the ranch, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, making sure there were no rough edges that could harm the precious child who would sleep in it. In early October, after a day of increasing contractions, Fiona's labor began in earnest. Mrs. Crawford, the rancher's wife who had experience as a midwife, came to assist, along with Margaret. Tanner was sent to wait downstairs in the library, the traditional place for nervous fathers, where Reverend Sullivan and a few other men kept him company through the long night. The labor was hard, lasting nearly 18 hours, and there were moments when Tanner, hearing Fiona cry out upstairs, nearly broke down the door to get to her. Only John Sullivan's firm hand on his shoulder and calm reassurance that this was normal, that she was strong, kept him from interfering. Finally, as dawn broke over Red Bluff on October 7, 1883, a baby's cry pierced the air. Tanner was on his feet immediately, and moments later, Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, smiling tiredly. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy baby boy, and Fiona is doing well. You can come up now." Tanner took the stairs 3 at a time. He burst into the room to find Fiona propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. Mrs. Crawford was cleaning up, and everything smelled of blood and sweat and something else, something primal and essential. "Come meet your son," Fiona said softly, and there was such love in her voice, such pride and joy. Tanner approached slowly, almost reverently. Fiona pulled back the blanket so he could see the baby's face, tiny and red and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that couldn't seem to focus yet. The baby made a small sound, and Tanner felt his heart crack open in a way he'd never experienced before. "He's beautiful," Tanner whispered. "He's perfect. Fiona, you're amazing. You did this." "We did this," she corrected. "Together. Would you like to hold him?" Tanner was terrified he'd do it wrong, but with Fiona and Mrs. Crawford's guidance, he learned how to support the baby's head, how to hold him securely but gently. The weight of his son in his arms was the most significant thing Tanner had ever held. This tiny person, half him and half Fiona, their future made flesh, their love given form. "We need to name him," Fiona said. "What do you think?" They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on anything definitively. Now, looking down at his son, Tanner said, "William, it was my father's name. William Foster, if that's all right with you." "William," Fiona repeated, testing it. "Well, for short, I love it." "William Foster, welcome to the world, little one. You're so very loved." The days that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Neither of them had realized how much work a baby would be. how little sleep they'd get, how their entire world would reorganize itself around this tiny person's needs. But they also discovered depths of love they hadn't known existed, a fierce protective tenderness that overwhelmed them both. Tanner would come home from the ranch and immediately take over baby care so Fiona could rest. He'd walk William around their small room, singing softly to him, telling him stories about the ranch and the horses and the wide Dakota sky. He'd change diapers, which he'd never imagined doing, and found he didn't mind at all because it was for his son. Fiona continued her library work, though on a reduced schedule, bringing William down with her during the day. He'd sleep in the cradle Tanner had made while she worked, and the children who came for reading time were enchanted by the baby. Several of the older girls would help watch him, treating him like a precious doll, learning early lessons in childcare. As William grew from infant to baby, his personality emerged. He was curious and alert, always watching everything with serious eyes. He rarely cried unless he was hungry or needed changing, and he seemed to find comfort in the sound of Fiona's voice reading aloud, calming immediately when she started a story. "He's going to love books just like his mother," Tanner observed one evening when William was about 6 months old, watching the baby stare at the pages as Fiona read. "I hope so," Fiona said. "But even if he doesn't, we'll love whatever he becomes. We'll support who he is, not try to make him into who we want him to be." "Agreed," Tanner said. "Though I wouldn't mind if he wanted to work with horses. I could teach him everything I know." Life continued its rhythm, the seasons turning. William grew, hitting milestones that filled his parents with pride and wonder. His first smile, his first laugh, the day he rolled over, the day he sat up on his own. Each achievement was celebrated like the miracle it was. Tanner's hard work paid off when Mr. Crawford made him foreman of the ranch in the spring of 1885, just as he'd hoped. The raise in wages was substantial, and for the first time, Tanner and Fiona had breathing room financially. They continued to save diligently, their dream of their own place growing closer to reality. "I've been looking at land," Tanner told Fiona one evening. William, now nearly 2 years old, was playing on the floor with wooden blocks Tanner had carved. "There's a piece about 4 miles from Red Bluff, 40 acres with a creek running through it. Good grazing land, some trees for timber. The owner is willing to sell for a reasonable price." Fiona's eyes lit up. "Do we have enough?" "Almost. If we can save for another 6 months, we'll have enough for the land and to start building a house. Nothing fancy at first, maybe just 2 rooms and a loft, but we can add on as we're able." "Tanner, that sounds wonderful. Our own land, our own home." "I want to do this right," he said seriously. "I want to build us something solid, something that'll last. A real home for you and William and any other children we might have. A place where we belong, where we can put down roots." She crossed to him and kissed him soundly. "We already belong together. The place doesn't matter as much as the people. But yes, let's do this. Let's build our home." They purchased the land in October of 1885, 2 years after William's birth. It was a significant moment, the first time either of them had owned property, had a stake in something permanent. Tanner held the deed in his hands like it was a sacred document, and in a way it was. It represented everything they'd worked for, every sacrifice, every penny saved, every dream they'd shared in the quiet of night. That winter, Tanner spent every spare moment working on the house. Several men from the church helped, including Reverend Sullivan and some of the ranch hands from Crawford's place. It was hard work, but there was joy in it, the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. By spring, the basic structure was complete. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above for sleeping, a solid roof, a good fireplace and stove. They moved in on a sunny day in May 1886. It wasn't much, their house. The floors were rough planks. The walls were bare logs that would need chinking. There was no glass in the windows yet, just oiled paper that let in light but kept out most of the weather. But it was theirs, built by Tanner's hands, filled with furniture they'd acquired slowly over the years and books that Fiona had collected. That first night in their new home, after William was asleep in the loft, Tanner and Fiona stood in the main room looking around at what they'd accomplished. "We did it," Fiona said softly. "We built a life together, a real life with a home and a family and a future." "You're still the best story I ever knew," Tanner said, pulling her close. "Every day with you is better than the last. Every challenge we face together. Every joy is doubled because I share it with you." "I love you," she said simply. "I loved you when you found me reading by candlelight in that lined shack. I loved you when you helped me find a place in Red Bluff. I loved you when you promised me forever. And I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." He kissed her deeply, pouring 5 years of love and commitment and partnership into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he said, "Let's read together tonight, in our house in front of our fire. Let's start a new story." So they did, settling onto the simple couch Tanner had built, Fiona reading aloud while Tanner held her close, their voices mingling with the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of their son sleeping above them. It was a perfect moment, ordinary and extraordinary at once, the kind of moment that makes up a life well lived. The years that followed were full and rich. Tanner continued working as foreman at the Crawford Ranch while also developing their own small operation on their 40 acres. He started with a few head of cattle, building the herd slowly. Fiona maintained her role as librarian, though she now commuted to Red Bluff 3 times a week instead of living above the library. She brought William with her, and he grew up among books and stories, learning to read before he was 5 years old. In 1887, Fiona became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy felt easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in February 1888, a winter baby with her mother's auburn hair and her father's brown eyes. William, now 4, was fascinated by his little sister, always wanting to help care for her, to hold her, to show her his toys. Tanner added onto the house, building another room downstairs for the children as they grew. He installed real glass windows, ordered from Chicago at considerable expense, but worth it to see Fiona's face light up when they arrived. He built furniture, cabinets, shelves for the ever-growing collection of books. Their home became comfortable, lived in, loved. The community of Red Bluff continued to grow around them. New families arrived, drawn by the railroad and the promise of land. The town added a proper school, and when Sarah was old enough, both children attended. Fiona eventually gave up her librarian position to focus on their growing family and the ranch work, but Margaret Sullivan continued the library, always crediting Fiona with establishing it. In 1890, when William was 7 and Sarah was 2, Fiona became pregnant a 3rd time. This pregnancy was harder, perhaps because she was older now, approaching 30. The baby, another boy they named Thomas, was born in November, and the delivery was difficult enough that the doctor warned them it might not be safe for Fiona to have more children. 3 is plenty, Tanner said firmly, holding his wife's hand as she recovered. "I have you and 3 beautiful children. That's more blessing than I ever imagined possible. I'm not risking your health for more." "I agree," Fiona said tiredly. 3 is perfect. Our family is complete." They settled into the rhythm of a family with 3 children, the noise and chaos and joy of it all. William grew tall and serious, with his father's quiet intensity and his mother's love of learning. He excelled at school and helped with the ranch work, learning everything Tanner could teach him about horses and cattle and working the land. Sarah was bright and cheerful, always singing, always finding joy in small things. She loved the ranch animals and the wide open spaces, and she had her mother's gift for storytelling, making up elaborate tales for her younger brother. Thomas, the baby, was adventurous and fearless, keeping his parents on constant alert. He was also tender-hearted, crying if any animal was hurt, bringing home injured birds and rabbits for his mother to nurse back to health. Tanner watched his children grow with wonder and gratitude. He taught them to ride, to rope, to care for animals, to work hard and be honest. Fiona taught them to read and write, to think critically, to be kind and compassionate. Together, they instilled values of integrity and respect, of hard work balanced with joy, of family above all else. The ranch prospered. By 1895, they had a substantial herd, and Tanner had hired 2 hands to help with the work. He was no longer just a cowboy working for wages, but a rancher, a landowner, a respected member of the community. He served on the town council, helped organize community events, was someone people came to for advice and assistance. Fiona became known for her work with literacy, tutoring children and adults who wanted to improve their reading. She organized a book club for women in Red Bluff, and it became a vital social and intellectual outlet for women on isolated ranches. She wrote occasional pieces for the local newspaper, essays about books and education and life on the frontier. Their children thrived. William, at 12, was already talking about going to college, perhaps studying agriculture or veterinary medicine. Sarah, at 7, was the star pupil at school, reading at a level far beyond her years. Thomas, at 5, was just starting school, bringing home crude drawings and early writing attempts that his parents displayed proudly. One evening in the fall of 1895, 14 years after Tanner had found Fiona reading by candlelight in that abandoned line shack, they sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the Dakota sky in shades of gold and crimson. The children were inside, supposedly doing homework but more likely getting into some mischief. The cattle were settled for the night, the horses fed and watered, the day's work done. "You ever think about that night?" Fiona asked, her hand in Tanner's, "when you found me in the line shack?" "All the time," Tanner admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if I'd ridden past, if I'd never opened that door, if I'd never met you. I think about it too. I was so scared and alone, and then you appeared. Like something out of one of my books, The Lonely Cowboy Riding to the Rescue," she smiled. "Except you turned out to be so much better than any fictional hero. You were real and flawed and kind, and you changed everything for me." "You changed everything for me too," Tanner said, squeezing her hand. "You gave me a reason to stop drifting. You showed me what home really means. You made me a husband and a father and a better man than I ever would have been without you." "I've been thinking," Fiona said. "I want to write our story down. Not for publication or anything like that, but for our children and their children. So they know where we came from, what we survived, how we found each other. I want them to know that love stories don't just happen in books. They happen in lined shacks and libraries and on dusty trails. They happen when 2 lonely people find each other and choose to build something together." "I like that idea," Tanner said. "Though I still say you're the writer in the family. You'll make it sound much better than I ever could." "We'll write it together," Fiona decided. "You tell me the story and I'll write it down, and it'll be both of ours. Our story in our words." So they did. Over the following months, in the evenings after the children were in bed, they worked on their story together. Tanner would talk, remembering details Fiona had forgotten or sharing his perspective on events she remembered differently. Fiona would write it all down, shaping it into narrative, making sure both their voices came through. They wrote about the Line Shack and the Candlelight, about the stolen horse and the stagecoach robbery, about the ride to Red Bluff, and the unexpected kindness of strangers who became family. They wrote about falling in love quickly and deeply, about building a life together through hard work and sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to each other. They wrote about their children, their ranch, their community, all of it stemming from that one night when a lonely cowboy and a woman alone with her books crossed paths in the wilderness. When they finished the manuscript, Fiona bound it carefully in leather and placed it on a special shelf in their home, labeled simply "Our Story." She read it aloud to the children, who were fascinated to hear about their parents' earlier lives before they existed. "Will you read it to your children someday?" Fiona asked William, who at 13 was already thinking about his future. "I will," he promised. "And I'll tell them that love is the greatest adventure, greater than anything in any book, because it's real and it lasts forever." The years continued their steady march forward. The children grew and changed, finding their own paths. William did go to college, studying agriculture at the New Land Grant University in Brookings, South Dakota. He returned to Red Bluff afterward, taking over more of the ranch operation as Tanner aged. He married a local girl, a teacher named Elizabeth, and they built a house on the other side of the 40 acres, starting their own family but staying close. Sarah surprised everyone by wanting to be a doctor. It was rare for women, especially on the frontier, but Fiona and Tanner supported her dream completely. They sent her to medical school in Chicago, scraping together the money through loans and scholarships and their savings. She graduated in 1903 and returned to Red Bluff to practice, becoming the first female doctor in the territory and a source of immense pride to her parents. Thomas, the youngest, did stay on the ranch, taking to the work like he was born to it. He had Tanner's gift with horses and Fiona's easy way with people, and he became a respected horse trainer, people bringing their problem horses from miles around for him to work with. As Tanner and Fiona grew older, they gradually stepped back from the daily work, letting their children take over while they enjoyed a quieter pace. They spent their days reading together, working in Fiona's garden, visiting with grandchildren who began to arrive as their children married and started families of their own. In 1910, when they were both in their 50s, Red Bluff held a celebration for their 28th wedding anniversary. The whole town turned out, recognizing them as foundational members of the community, people whose love story and dedicated work had helped shape Red Bluff into what it had become. Tanner stood before the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention, but knowing he needed to say something. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, and the crowd laughed affectionately. "But I want to thank all of you for being part of our lives, for welcoming a lonely cowboy and a woman alone with her books all those years ago, for helping us build not just a home but a life worth living. My wife is the greatest story I ever knew, and every day with her has been a blessing. Here's to many more years together." The crowd applauded and Fiona joined him, tears streaming down her face. "And here's to all of you," she added, "because home isn't just a place or even a person. It's a community, people who care for each other, who show up when needed, who celebrate together and mourn together and build something lasting together. Red Bluff is our home and you are our family." They lived to see their golden wedding anniversary in 1932, 50 years of marriage, a rare achievement in any era. By then, They had 12 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, a legacy that extended far beyond what either of them had imagined possible that night in the line shack. The celebration was smaller this time, just family gathered on the ranch they'd built together. Tanner was 77 now, still strong but moving more slowly. Fiona was 73, her auburn hair completely white now but her green eyes still bright with intelligence and love. Their children gave speeches, their grandchildren performed songs and skits, and the great-grandchildren toddled around causing delightful chaos. When it was time to cut the cake, Tanner and Fiona stood together, his hand over hers on the knife, and the photographer captured the moment, the two of them looking not at the camera but at each other, still so clearly in love after 50 years. That night, long after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Tanner and Fiona sat together in the room where they'd spent so many evenings reading together. The walls were lined with shelves now, full of books accumulated over a lifetime. Their story, written so many years ago, sat in its place of honor, worn now from being read and reread to children and grandchildren. "Read to me," Tanner said, as he had so many times over the decades. Fiona reached for their story, the one they'd written together, and opened it to the first page. Her voice, though older now, was still clear and melodious as she read the words they'd crafted so carefully, reliving their journey from that first meeting to this moment. 50 years of love and partnership, and building something beautiful together. When she finished, she closed the book gently and looked at her husband. "The lonely cowboy became the greatest story I ever knew," she said softly. "And I've known many stories, Tanner. I've read thousands of books, lived in countless imaginary worlds. But none of them compare to the story we wrote together, the life we built, the love we shared." "You gave me everything," Tanner said, his voice rough with emotion. "Home, family, purpose, love. You took a drifting cowboy with nothing and showed him what it meant to belong somewhere to someone. You're still the best thing that ever happened to me, Fiona Foster." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they sat there in comfortable silence, surrounded by books and memories and the evidence of a life well lived together. The candles they'd lit for the celebration burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, not unlike that night so long ago when a cowboy found a woman reading by candlelight, and both their lives changed forever. They lived several more years together, eventually passing within months of each other as often happens with couples who have been together for so long. Tanner went first, in his sleep, peacefully, with Fiona beside him as she'd been for 52 years. She followed him 4 months later, simply unable or unwilling to live in a world without her partner, her love, her home. Their children buried them side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a single headstone that read, "Tanner and Fiona Foster." They found each other in the wilderness and built a love that lasted forever. The greatest story ever told was the one they lived together. The ranch stayed in the family, passing down through generations. The house they'd built was expanded and modernized, but never torn down. The original 2 rooms preserved as a testament to humble beginnings and determined love. The book of their story remained on its shelf, read to each new generation of Fosters, ensuring that the tale of how a lonely cowboy found a woman reading by candlelight, and how that chance meeting transformed 2 solitary lives into something magnificent, would never be forgotten. And in Red Bluff, South Dakota, where both of them had found home and purpose and community, their names were remembered with affection and respect. 2 people who'd helped build a town and who'd shown everyone who knew them what true love looked like. Not perfect, not easy, but real and lasting and worth every sacrifice. The library that Fiona had started so many years ago was eventually named in her honor, and over the entrance was carved a quote from their story. "Good stories feel real. That's what makes them matter." It was a fitting tribute to a woman who'd loved books all her life, but who discovered that the best story wasn't one she'd read, but one she'd lived. Word by precious word, day by precious day, with the lonely cowboy who'd opened a door one cold October night and found his future waiting inside. Reading by candlelight.